Drop it on the random.
What up, y'all? I am your host, Vegas, and this is Hip Hop Now Podcast, a bonus episode straight for the Patreon supporters out there. You know what I'm saying? Exclusively for a time period. And if you would like to become a Patreon supporter, all you got to do is visit patreon.com/hip-hop. Now, pick a tier, be a one-time supporter or a monthly supporter. Regardless of how you support, it is greatly appreciated. And on this episode, this bonus episode, being in quarantine, and if you out of quarantine because you're from the future, you know what to do. You need to get your ass out of here. But I was thinking, right? And I'm like, yeah, you know, everybody's doing Zoom and, you know, getting together with these virtual parties and DJs and then producers doing battles on Instagram and all this good stuff. And I saw a lot of people that were like bored. Like people like me work from home, so it's like I'm working, so I just have to work. But then there are other people who probably still get paid, and there are those people out there, shout out to you, who still have to go out and work during this time. But there's just a lot of people who during this crazy time are like looking for content, looking for things to do, to watch, to listen to. And this being a hip hop podcast, I was like, how about I do 10 hip hop albums for sheltered in place hip hop heads. Now, if you're a true hip hop head, you probably heard all of these albums, so props to you. But this is less about what you know or what I know or whatever, and more of a recommendation. I have 10 albums here that I feel are journeys. I've always kind of thought this about albums because this is how my love for hip hop albums goes. You know, if you don't know, Ice Cube's Death Certificate is probably my favorite album of all time. Not necessarily because I feel like it's the greatest hip hop album ever made above all other hip hop albums, but mainly because I feel like when I heard that album, that was the first time I spent my own money to buy an album that was a classic. Right? At the time, I kind of felt, I didn't say it was a classic at the time because a lot of people didn't really talk like that, hip hop heads. But at the time, I felt like, yo, this album is dope. You know, that was my biggest thing. Like, this album is dope from beginning to end. And I always felt like, you know, whether I was traveling to and from school or in my room, and I'm listening to this album with the skits and the intro and the, you know, A side versus the B side, which was the light and dark side on that particular album. And I always felt like this is what good albums are. Good albums are like journeys, you know what I'm saying, through whatever content this artist chooses to represent or present to you. So I felt like during this quarantine time, I was like, what albums are out there as far as a variety that are journeys when you listen to them, whether you heard them or not, or and this is not just about telling stories or having multiple concepts, but albums that just sound like soundtracks to whatever. You know what I'm saying? Doesn't matter if it's soundtracks to when you used to smoke or reminds you of something else or whatever the case may be, but albums that feel like soon as you hit play, that intro hits, a tone is set, and that tone is carried throughout every other song, every skit, or every song, every skit, from the album cover to the music, as far as the production, everything. An album that that feels like a meal. So I hope I did a good job of giving a description of what these 10 albums will represent, and I'll give a little piece on, you know, what they are as far as why you should listen to them or even go back and listen to them, because I feel like this is a good enough variety for you to just go down hip hop's memory lane. It's mostly old school, not too old, but not too far back, some far up also. So let's get into the first one in no particular order. Redman's There Is a Dark Side. This was Redman's second album. I was a huge Redman fan at the time. Still am, but a way bigger fan back then in the early 90s than I am today, to be honest. But There's a Dark Side is so different from his debut, What the Album. There's a Dark Side that Redman personally has said on record that he doesn't like. But me, I love this album because it's so dark and gritty. And I'm not just talking about lyrics, I'm talking about beats. The best Redman to me is not the Redman you see today. That Redman can still rap. It's not the Redman that was with Method Man. That Redman can still rap. Not the name Redman either, but funk beats, Eric Sermon, real dirty, grimy sounding funk samples. Almost like if Dr. Dre had, G-Funk, Redman had P-Funk, but this was like the East Coast version of those West Coast style funk beats. And it's such a cerebral album in a lot of senses, because you could tell Redman was still trying to be nice on a mic, but he was trying to do something. He was trying to make something that was dark and gritty and grimy and funky at the same time. And from beginning to end is just this journey that's, just so dope. And even when I took a break, hadn't heard it in years, and went back and listened to it, and I was just like, man, this album is underrated in his catalog, because obviously he came out with Muddy Waters, which is without a doubt his best album in my opinion. But There's a Dark Side is a really good one. Another good one, and it's kind of sort of on the flip side, is The Great Adventures of Slick Rick. Slick Rick's debut album on Def Jam Records. And I say this because one time I was on, shout out to the homie Kill, follow him at Kill889 or Kill889 Apartment 5B on Twitter, because he's in Twitter jail or whatever. But the point is, I was on one of his shows and we were talking about storytelling, and he was trying to dispel the notion that Slick Rick is like the greatest storyteller or a great storyteller or whatever the case may be, because the stories were kind of like, basic. But obviously he set the tone for a lot of storytelling in hip hop with an album in The Greatest Adventures of Slick Rick, where every song is a story. I don't think anybody's ever done that. Like, people have made albums that have had stories in them, but every song is a story of some sort. And the thing is, it's playful, but it's also for adults. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like Rick and Morty, right? Where it's a cartoon. Cartoons are for kids, right? But then when you watch it, you're like, oh, wait, this is for adults. You know what I'm saying? It's like any of the Family Guy, any of those cartoons, even like Ren and Stimpy, and in some cases even SpongeBob. Some of the things that are underneath what SpongeBob will do and say, I mean, they're not grimy, but at the same time, I felt like Slick Rick just had all these stories that involve drugs and violence and sex and even inspirational records, and they all tell cautionary tales and different stories like that. And I just feel like when you listen to it, it's like really sitting down and listening to bedtime stories as a kid, but told by your uncle, who probably shouldn't be telling you that he was once a pimp and what happened when he tried to catch Fast Eddie at the strip joint and chase him into the fish market. And you get my point. But Slick Rick, not a children's story, is The Great Adventures of Slick Rick. Definitely an album in quarantine that you can kind of cleanse your palate after listening to Redman's There's a Dark Side. The next one is Common's One Day It Will All Make Sense. Hands down my favorite Common album, but what I really enjoy about this album is, again, for the very same reason, when it starts, that intro, you feel like, oh, this man really thought about what this album was going to be, because you don't have this kind of beat on this kind of music in your intro, and you don't talk like that unless you've been in a lab. And I'm telling you, starts with real nigga quotes. Wait, is that yeah, I think so. I can't remember right now, but whatever. The point is from song to song, he's taking you through a journey of him as a lyricist, him as a a father to be, but it didn't go down that way. All types of records, all types of guest appearances, and it's just an album that's chocked full of so much relatable content as an artist, as a human being. And I feel like if maybe you've never heard a Common album, or you kind of got put on to Common when he became an actor mostly, and maybe you like a lot of his newer music. Maybe you got put on to him because you heard the record he did with John Legend that won a Grammy and an Oscar, and maybe you was like, oh well, let me listen to his new album. But this is an album, if you go back, where I feel there's a lot of balance lyrically in what Common does on this album, and it's just another example of an album you could put on and just let Common take control of the storytelling and let the beats and the variety of beats at that kind of captivate you and get you into that hip-hop mood, because not all the beats are the same. That's what I like about it. It's a nice variety on the production side as well. Another album, Wyclef's solo debut album, The Carnival. I did not know what this album was going to be when it dropped. All I knew is that I liked the Fugees, the score, a lot. Obviously, Lauryn Hill is dopest out of the group, but I always thought Wyclef was just as dope. He was just as dope as an MC in a lot of respects. I don't think he gets a lot of credit for that, but also a dope musician. And his debut album, The Carnival, is so chocked full of culture. Like, I don't think there's really ever been an album on this scale, at least, that captures that. And I think that's what kind of makes this album worth listening to, because Wyclef is rapping over beats that you wouldn't think anybody would ever rap over. And the whole point of it is Carnival, right? Carnival is about a lot of cultures celebrating. They typically have a parade in different cities, some in DC, some in BK on Labor Day, some down in their countries. And a lot of the music and the instruments on this album represented that. And Wyclef raps, he sings, he does probably one of the best Bob Marley impressions out there, and it's just such a dope album, such a culture rich album, that I feel like if you are going to take on this list by myself that I'm giving to you, you need some variety. And man, if you listen to those three albums I said before and you hit The Carnival, you'll feel like you're on a journey in itself. But that's the point of this podcast, right? Next up, Skyzoo's Music for My Friends. I think this is a very dope album, because what Skyzoo is excellent at is articulating what it is he wants you to get, not only in his verses, but in his songs, and more importantly, his album concepts. And having an album like this, where he makes music with his friends in mind, their tastes, their inspirations, him growing up, it feels like you're watching a show or a Spike Lee joint, or some program or some form of entertainment about a group of kids on a block, and one of those kids is telling that story. And I think that's what I really like about this album. Probably was the first album, I know he got other dope albums, but probably the first album from Skyzoo where I really started to respect him as a dude who not only is a dope lyricist, but really cares about the projects he makes, and you can tell when you listen to him. Another one, this one is an absolute classic, A Tribe Called Quest, Low End Theory. I love this album the day I heard it. I mean, from the beginning to the very end with Scenario, you talk about a journey. You talk about the jazz samples, like, introducing not to the game as a whole, but most importantly for a Tribe Called Quest being a major player in ushering in jazz samples in hip-hop, because they were used so well. So we got to give a shout out to Q-Tip for that. But Low End Theory is such a dope album because Q-Tip verses are on point. Phife Dawg, rest in peace, verses are on point. The beats are on point. I think the only joint I don't like is the Sky Pager joint, because it feels like filler on an album that just flows from song to song so beautifully. And again, the samples used here, the music, like the soundscape of this album is so plush in a lot of ways, but still boom bap, still hard as it needs to be as a rap album, you know what I'm saying? But it just sounds so good. Like, the same reasons why people love Wu-Tang Clan's debut album, Into the 36 Chambers, right? It's because it sounds dirty and grimy and like low budget on purpose. And that's what kind of makes it dope. What would be considered the bad sound would be considered dope. Like, that's the reason why you like it. And I feel like with Low End Theory, the lush, samples are, and picking from jazz to some soul tracks and stuff like that, they just all work together, you know what I'm saying? And by the time you get to the end of Scenario, which you would think like, well, when I hear Scenario, I don't hear jazz, but it's something consistent about all those beats. I don't know if it's the drums or the kicks or the snares. There's something consistent about all those beats, even though they're varied in styles. Next up is an album that I always tell people is dope, and you need to stop sleeping. You need to check it out. And if you've heard this podcast, or you heard me, or on somebody else's podcast, or whatever the case may be, I'll say it a million times, because I didn't believe either before I heard it. That's Sticky Fingers, Black Trash, the autobiography of Kurt Jones. Now, I know when I say that, you're like, what? Who? I get it. I said the same thing. But what makes this album so dope, and to me worthy of a quarantine spin, because you ain't doing nothing, you in the crib, right, is the fact that whereas Slick Rick was telling a story on every song, Sticky Fingers made an album that is a story. Now, we can say that about any album, like, oh, well, that album's a story and this album's a story. No, I mean literally every skit, every song is a part of one story that's being told. So, for example, because I'm not going to spoil any of it, because it's like spoiling a movie, but for example, right, if the skit is about a guy getting out of jail, right, and then by the end of that skit, his homie's like, let's go to the strip club, that next song is about the strip club. And what makes it dope, it's not like he's telling a story in every song. Some of those songs are just songs, but they match what they supposed to represent. You know what I'm saying? So if it's a strip club song, he's talking about, we throwing up money and blah, blah, blah. He's not necessarily saying his name, the character's name and all of that, but the song goes with the skit. And then another skit will follow that and lead into another song, and it's just seamless. And he has guest appearances, and the guest appearances play their role in the entire story. If you ask me, is the greatest hip-hop concept album of all time, and it's criminally slept on, but you in quarantine, and this is your perfect time to check it out. We only got 3 more to go. Next up is actually a mixtape by a dude named XV, and it's called Popular Culture. Now, I remember I saw a review, shout out to hiphopdx.com. I saw a review on hiphopdx.com years ago about this mixtape, And so, I was just looking for something new to listen to. So I was like, oh, well, I'll check it out. This joint is called Popular Culture. On the cover of the mixtape is like The Simpsons, the Simpsons scene where they all run to the couch and sit on that couch and watch TV. But on that couch, he has like Kanye and Kanye's there, Michael Jordan's there, the Joker, Heath Ledger's the Joker's there. A number of like characters, like Back to the Future characters, a bunch of characters sitting on this couch, the Simpsons couch. And it's about pop culture, right? But what's so dope about this is a dope hip hop mixtape that intertwines these different looks of pop culture and sound bites of pop culture from mostly the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s. And I was just so impressed by it because I'm like, wow, I know what it's like to create a song. I know what it's like to come up with a concept, try to have a concept for an album or a mixtape in this case. And a lot of times some cats get to the point of, coming up with the name and the concept in their head and what the cover would sound like, but they don't really execute it. And I feel like this joint is so surprising when you listen to it because it feels like somebody turning the channel and turning and seeing The Simpsons and turning and watching Michael Jordan and Michael Jackson and seeing Kim and Kanye West. Like, it feels like pop culture, being framed in this mixtape. And again, is he just rapping about a bunch of pop culture? No, he's rapping, and it's dope, and the beats are dope, and it has guest appearances like Schoolboy Q. Definitely worth your time, definitely worth checking out. Next up, Jay Electronica's EP, Style Wars. This is the EP that made Jay Electronica prior to Exhibit C. Exhibit C made him way bigger than this did, but this is what got his buzz going. Features production from Dilla to Mr. Porter, and that's mostly like Jay Elect rapping over like Dilla beats from like Donuts and like beat mixtapes and stuff like that, or albums. But what I really liked about it, I love the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory themes and the Matrix themes and his Jay Electronica's lyrics. I mean, you probably know, if you follow him, but they tend to be like really, I don't want to say technical, like he's rapidy rap, but they tend to lean on a conspiracy theory type mind, or woke, like some would say, but not heavy. You know what I'm saying? He's not heavy-handed with it. He's poetic with it. And I think that's what lends itself to using a lot of the Willy Wonka stuff as metaphors. You know what I'm saying? Like the skits or whatever, or sound bites from that movie, using them as metaphors, using some sound bites from the Matrix as metaphors. And I think it set a tone where this EP has a real muddy, grimy, rightfully so because of how it was produced, but grimy sound to it. And lyrically, it's just like this dude is creating poetry. It's not really like rap. And the only reason why I would say or suggest this to any listener out of these 10 is the simple fact that this is why people liked Jay Electronica. I'll give you another analogy. It's like D'Angelo, right? Some of us were D'Angelo fans when the Brown Sugar album came out, right? Day ones, ate it up. But then when he did his second album and the record Untitled came out, then he got the fans that ignored Brown Sugar, because then he became more of a superstar, artist. And that's the same thing with Jay Electronica. When Style Wars was out, EP, he was like an underground like gem, somebody who you didn't really see going beyond a certain point as far as status in the game, not necessarily for lyrics, but just for the lyrical content that he put out and how he would do what he do. So you never really saw him being anything bigger than that, because you didn't see him as a radio guy. You didn't see him having a radio hit. But then he does Exhibit C with Just Blaze and people go crazy for it. But if you listen to his lyrics, he's the same dude. And I think Style Wars is such a deeper look at what he can, basically what he can create in a solo album, not an album with Jay-Z. But definitely check that out. And the last one is more of a instrumental beat tape type album. It's the Alchemist Russian Roulette. This joint has about 20 plus songs. It does feature some rappers, but what I really like about it is the production. Some of the beats are dope, but it's the way he has beats. He has sound bite, the way he uses the sound bites and all these different elements to create this long ass album. And it doesn't feel, it's not that long, don't get me wrong, but you don't expect something like this to be able to hit play and just let it ride. And the thing is when you're just listening and you're not looking at any song titles, you don't know when a rapper's coming on. You don't know how long a beat's gonna be, because none of it is really just like, well, I just loop this up and this is track 1 and I'm gonna loop this up and it's track 2. Nah, man, it's literally like a sound roller coaster that occasionally has rappers pop in and out of some of the records, and it's dope. So that's it for me. That's 10 hip-hop albums for sheltered in place hip-hop heads. I think is definitely worth going through all 10. You know what I'm saying? If you want, or if you have some other suggestions, leave those in the comment section below. You know what I'm saying? We all hip-hop heads. We all love discovering something new, something we slept on, hearing it for the first time. And I think this is a nice variety of albums to take a journey on. Like, maybe you got 10 days and you need to exercise an hour per day. Maybe each day you listen to one of these records, you know what I'm saying, as you work out, and you really absorb and take in what that hip-hop artist was trying to convey through their lyrics, through their music, and the entire concept of these projects. That's going to do it for me. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Vegas World INC, and please know, support the Patreon at patreon.com/hiphop. Now, until next time, y'all, I am not a critic, I'm a fan. Peace.
Drop it on the random.